Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this third webinar this year on trade matters. And today's topic is finding a competitive edge in disruption. 2020 has been a masterclass for all of us in dealing with disruption. And of course, in trade, that translates into disrupted supply chains. And you can see a variety of things happening, whether it's potential decoupling between the world's number one and number two largest economies, whether it's because of COVID-19 and countries wanting to protect their supply chains or bring supply chains closer to home. How do you really reroute, for want of a better word, your supply chain and get an edge in all of this disruption so that you and your business can continue to survive and hopefully thrive? We're delighted to welcome back our favorite expert on all matters trade, and that's Dr. Deborah Elms. Really terrific to have you back, Deborah. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you for always sharing your expertise in terms that are clear and relevant to businesses. Because as you and I have discussed before, that's one of the biggest challenges we all face, particularly with taking advantage of free trade agreements. Just the sheer complexity of the language and complexity of the terms. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Deborah. I'll be back after Deborah's made her remarks just to moderate a Q&A. So at any time during this webinar, please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box. And if you haven't already done so, have a bit of fun with Nobi and tell us how you feel this tool is good for you or not in terms of being a proxy for networking. So, okay, without further ado, Deborah, the floor is yours. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. I am genuinely delighted to be here and having this conversation again with all of the companies that are on the line. And I appreciate the opportunity, especially to work with SICC, which I think has been one of the trade associations at the cutting edge, to be honest, in providing the kind of practical advice and encouragement that firms need at a time of such disruption. So I'm really happy to be back here again to be talking about supply chains, trade, disruption, and driving more certainty and less risk into your operations. So I have a presentation that I can deliver, although I prefer not to actually do that many slides, but because I have a couple that are complicated, I think I'm gonna have to use slides this time. Let me go ahead, I guess, and put them on the screen, and then you'll have this available to you. Share. Excellent. So once we're finished, you can have these slides as well. And I will note that we are working currently on a booklet that will go along with this kind of presentation. Similar to what we've actually done with SICC before on describing EU, Singapore, and EU, Vietnam FTAs, but this one is much more, how do I, just a sort of basic primer, how do I actually use trade agreements? Because one of the things that we've been discovering from firms that are coming in to see us about how to restructure their supply chains or how to think differently about supply chains is that many companies are convinced that they should do something. They're convinced that trade agreements are a good way to start or to at least contribute to this conversation about how do we restructure. But having reached that conclusion, then firms often seem to find themselves paralyzed with this sort of, where do we go from here? How do we make this happen? What are the steps we need to take? What are the issues we need to think through? And so this presentation and then the booklet, which should be out, I'm hoping within a couple of days, it's in the hands of our graphic designer to make it a little prettier than we can do it on our own. It will also give you additional insights. So if you want to get a copy of this booklet, please do contact either Victor at SICC. I'm sure he'll be happy to pass along our contact details, or reach out to us directly at the Asian Trade Center. So let me get into the conversation today, which is really about the importance, of course, of dealing with supply chain and disruption, all of which you know. So I'm actually going to skip through this one. And what I want to do is get to here. which is why should we think about free trade agreements in particular? And I would say there's a couple of reasons for doing so, but one big one is at a time of great disruption, firms need to increase their certainty and decrease risk. And while trade agreements are not the be all and end all on either one of these things, they are very helpful tools that companies can harness to provide a greater level of certainty going forward. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have a firm that we've been working with this week, in fact, who discovered the hard way that trade is uncertain. So they manufactured a particular product in China that they shipped to the United States. This product, as a result of ongoing US trade tensions in an entirely different sector that had nothing to do with their sector at all, suddenly got hit with a 25% tariff increase. So as part of the retaliation and cross-retaliation between the US and China over especially tech and tech transfer and so forth, this firm, which is not at all in the tech space, found themselves paying 25% more for a key product into the US market. Now, this happens to be their most lucrative product into their largest market, and all of a sudden cost 25% increase almost overnight. So the firm then said, wow, this is horrible, let's solve this problem. So they relocated production of a key part of their supply chain into the European Union, only to discover a couple of months later that they were suddenly hit with another 25% tariff increase as a result of, again, something that had nothing to do with their sector, retaliation on a fight between the US and the Europeans over aircraft. So twice this firm thought they had a perfect structure in place, and twice they ended up having to pay an overnight 25% increase. The firm has now used an entirely different set of trade agreements in which to get their products into the US at lower tariffs. And now, having gone through some of their supply chain, we've also identified that this is a risk for them as well, because two of the markets that they're using these particular types of agreements for are at risk because the countries that they're using are getting too wealthy and they're going to lose their trade benefits into the US, or for entirely other reasons, mostly related to human rights, they are at risk of losing these trade preferences into the United States. So this poor company that has tried so hard to avoid paying tariffs, not by doing anything illegal, let me point out, not by doing anything but following the rules, has found themselves twice and potentially 3 or even 4 times now having to navigate an uncertain environment as a result of tariff increases. Typically, we don't see tariffs that often, but in the last almost 3 years now, we've seen lots of these tariff escalations back and forth, particularly in and out of the US market, but increasingly in other places as well. And so this kind of disruption has been deeply problematic for firms. It's very hard to navigate. You've already got, of course, pandemic, which we're all very familiar with, but on top of that, other challenges that can be disruptive in your supply chain that you may not have thought of. And so how do you both get more competitiveness in general and ensure less risk of sudden changes, especially in policy, is to think about how do I map my current supply chain onto existing trade agreements? How do I think about future investment in particular? Can I change my structure? Can I take advantage of other trade agreements? And the net result of that does 2 things for you if we can manage to do this well. One is it lowers your costs. So if your competitor is paying 25% more than you are, then your product, of course, should be much more competitive just on straight costs compared to anyone else in the marketplace. So if they're still paying 25% and you pay 0, this is kudos to you, you should be doing very well. So the first is to just reduce your direct costs. The second is that it provides greater certainty because it's not a guarantee, but in general, when you use a trade agreement, you are at less risk, you are less exposed to these sudden kinds of retaliation, which happens when you don't have a trade agreement. So one of the reasons why this particular company we've been dealing with is at risk is that they're trying to export back to the United States. And the US has very few trade agreements in place, and particularly very few Asian trade agreements. So that makes it tough to find a good FTA that they can use in which it reduces their risk and increases their certainty. Compared to many of the firms that I think are on this call who are Asia-based, And Asia has the distinct advantage of having lots of free trade agreements in place. So it is likely, not guaranteed, but it is likely that there are not just one, but potentially multiple ways that you could leverage or harness a trade agreement to give you benefits that you wouldn't get if you weren't paying attention. So there's a whole lot of reasons to use trade agreements. Of course, the tariffs are the most obvious. Services companies as well often get better access, better market access, and better conditions for operating. Investors do much better, usually in a free trade area between two or more economies in a free trade agreement, because the certainty, again, is embedded in the agreement. There's a lot of things in agreements generally around customs and trade facilitation to, again, guarantee more certainty. And more rules, are not fantastic rules, but more rules around how we deal with product standards, which are becoming one of the biggest obstacles to trade in general. So in all of these different ways, trade agreements make a lot of sense for firms. So having said that, to a lot of companies, they say, okay, I bought your argument. This sounds fantastic. Now what? So let's see if we can do the now what. There are a lot of trade agreements in Asia. There are, well, nobody has a very good count, but there are several hundred different free trade agreements that crisscross Asia in particular. I am not going to say that you should look at all of them, because if you tried to look at all of them, you would, I don't think you can. Even with software systems in place to help you with this, managing that level of complexity is too difficult. So we suggest that as a first cut, you look at some of the larger regional agreements. And so we just put this slide together just to give you some sense of the way in which countries can be in multiple and overlapping trade agreements. So they can be members of ASEAN, they can be members of the CPTPP, which I'll talk about in some detail. That is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have 7 countries here in Asia involved in CPTPP. Benefits in that agreement, always the best, always. And I still make that promise, and I haven't yet been proven wrong. Always the best benefits in CPTPP. There's an agreement coming up, which is due to be signed next month on November 14th, virtually in Vietnam in some kind of weird holographic signature ceremony that will be very helpful for firms here in the region, because it includes all 10 members of ASEAN plus China, Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So 15 countries involved in the RCEP negotiations. When that deal gets signed, we will finally be able to see the texts and schedules and so forth, and you will be able to identify new opportunities for your firm for that agreement. But I will flag before I go much further that while RCEP is going to be very useful for firms, that one is going to be, I'll use a polite term, difficult to use, because it is an extremely complicated animal. And especially the early years of RCEP are going to need specialist help, I think, to guide firms through using the RCEP commitments, because it's just much more complicated than even CPTPP, which looks complicated but is less complicated. And then finally, let me just point out that the European Union has been more and more active in this region, and there are a number of excellent trade agreements, which we've already discussed in SICC webinars in the past, with Singapore, with Vietnam. They are coming up on the 9th round of negotiations, the EU and Australia. Also, I think the same round with New Zealand. So there are a lot of interesting European agreements that you can use to trade between different countries here in Asia and Europe. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you don't need to know a lot about all of them. You just need to know the most relevant ones for you. And the most relevant ones for you are those largely that cover the markets that you're interested in. So if you're not interested in Brunei, then you don't need to worry about any agreement that Brunei has or hasn't signed. You only focus on agreements that link Brunei with markets that you actually care about. So let me show you how this works. And this next slide, I think, oh, where's my, here we go, is a bit complicated, but I think it's useful for you to think about. So what are we trying to do here? We're trying to say there are 4 different ways for you to be able to think about using trade agreements to help your company. The axes on this are, can you move your sourcing? Is your sourcing fixed, or can you change where you get raw materials, parts, and components? So the sourcing for whatever you produce. And it doesn't have to be, let me make it clear, you don't have to be a complicated firm to see yourself as part of a supply chain. So if you are a firm that creates something fairly straightforward. You make, I don't know, candles, let's say, with fairly few ingredients, and you are a very small company, you can still think of yourself as having a supply chain because you source the components for that candle from wherever you source them from, the wax, the perfumes, the wick, the container. That's part of your supply chain, even if you don't personally think of it that way. So can you adjust where you source those parts and components from? And then can you move where you do the final manufacturing? So these are the two sort of dimensions that we have you thinking about, from you can't move anything, which is the bottom left quadrant here, to everything is open. You know, we're really taking an opportunity of the pandemic to rethink a lot of our existing operations, and we're going to rethink where we source from and where potentially we manufacture. So that's the top right quadrant on the screen. So let me go through these in a little bit more detail and give you a concrete example of peach jam. Okay, so the reason why we've chosen peach jam is that I assume you all have eaten peach jam. You know what it is. You know what the components are likely to be in peach jam, even if you don't know all of the details. So key component, obviously peaches. And what we've done here, and which we will also replicate in this booklet, is we have this extended example of peach jam to explain to you how this works. So let me just start with the one on the bottom, just to describe it in principle, and then I'll get into some details here on the next slide. In principle, now, the first thing that you should be doing, if you're a company, is say, nothing is moving. I'm not changing my sourcing. I'm not changing where I manufacture. I'm leaving everything exactly as it is. Are there any FTA benefits that I can harness today with no major changes? So that's FTA fishing. And the reason why we call it FTA fishing is that we all happily sit in Asia, where there may be multiple agreements that you can leverage. And so the goal here is to map what you do and where you do it onto a trade agreement and see if there's any benefits that you're missing out on. And in particular, I'm focusing here on tariff reductions. We could do the same kind of exercise for services firms and so forth, but I'm going to focus on trade and goods. So FTA fishing, nothing moves, but I'm going to look and see whether my existing footprint matches any FTA, and if so, am I claiming those benefits? And if so, am I getting those benefits, especially lower tariffs? So that's FTA fishing. That is the first step for most firms, is to just do that inventory. And you would be surprised, I think, at how many firms are missing out on opportunities to do FTA fishing and gain tariff benefits at the end of it, because they've never thought of it. They've never applied it. Their supply chain management is held in different business units. They don't coordinate. And so the end result is you're missing an opportunity to save money. The second category here, which we're calling factory bound, is the factory stays because we have an investment in the factory. We have workers. We're very comfortable with our people who supply our packaging and our distribution center and all of that. We're very happy. But we could change some of the components, the raw materials, the parts, etc. So if we did that, are there more benefits for us? So now we're thinking about changing up where we source our materials from. So in factory bound, factory stays, we look for different suppliers to our factory to see whether we can use an FTA and get better benefits. In the third quadrant, down in the bottom right corner, uniquely sourced, is I might be able to move my factory, but the raw materials are special. So in the case of, let's say, peach jam, the peaches that I'm sourcing are special. And I don't want to get peaches from anywhere because they're not as good, they're not as sweet, the timing is wrong, because I have long-term relationships with my suppliers that I don't want to disrupt. So I'm not moving the peaches, but I could move the factory where we produce this into jam. So I'm sticking with my sources, but I could move the factory where I produce it. And then the last one, we're calling them the aggressive optimizers, are firms that say, you know what, it's a new world out there and we need to really take this seriously. We're still going to produce the same kinds of things, but we could switch up, if necessary, both the sourcing and the factory, the manufacturing factory location. So we could really say, where are the best benefits in an FTA? And so the point of this chart is both to help you get some better clarity on the kinds of decisions you need to think through. Can I move sourcing? Can I move manufacturing? And then the opportunities that might evolve along the way, so that you don't feel like I suddenly as a firm have to jump all the way to quadrant 4, which for many companies feels entirely too ambitious. But for others feels like this is a great opportunity. If we're going to rethink our investment, let's rethink our investment, and let's do so in a way that is a little more structured and a little more careful around FTA benefits as one of the elements in this decision we're going to make. So let me give you the next chart. And before I do so, I just want you to take a deep breath. There's a lot. Oh, no, sorry. Before we get to this one, I thought it was the next one. I was like, wow, this was going to be bad. So this is the company. This is the basic case that we're talking about, Peach Jam here, which is, imagine that you are a company in Thailand. So your manufacturing location at the moment is Thailand, and you make peach jam with peaches from China, and you are exporting them to these 5 markets: Australia, Japan, the EU, USA, and Canada. Now, those are important markets, of course, very large populations, lots of people who eat peach jam. So this is a good setup for you, and has been a good setup for you, except that you'll notice here the Mfn tariff rates are not small. So Mfn tariff rate is, if I don't use any trade agreement at all, what are the rates that I have to pay on my peach jam exports into Australia, Japan, EU, US, and Canada? And you can see it varies from 5% into Australia to 24% into the European Union. That's a lot of money. So anything that we could do to drop those tariffs down to something closer to or at 0 gives you an advantage over other firms. So let's look at what that actually looks like then. And again, I apologize for this chart. It's complicated, but I think it's to put it all in one place. And I'll try to walk you through it. And again, if you have questions, please make sure that you ask me. So remember, I said the first scenario, FTA fishing, nothing moves. So we are leaving the sourcing of peaches from China. We're leaving manufacturing in Thailand. And we're trying to figure out, can we get benefits into Australia, Japan, EU, US, and Canada? So with our current model, peaches from China and marketing, producing the peach jam in Thailand, we have not that many options because of those markets. They're not all covered together, but we could potentially use Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, or ANSFTA FTA into Australia, and at least drop the 5% tariff into Australia down to 0. So there are some potential there for us to gain some market access benefits, some lower tariffs into Australia, but you'll notice that the other tariffs don't change. And they don't change because at least until we get an RCEP, there is no agreement that you can use between Thailand and Japan that covers peaches. So there is an agreement between Japan and ASEAN, ASEAN-Japan FTA, which you can see in this next one. I'll talk about it in just a second. There is an agreement, but it doesn't cover Thai peaches. And it doesn't cover peach jam, and it doesn't cover the equipment in the components in from China. So we can have an agreement in place, but depending on the rules, we may not be able to use this agreement. So under scenario 1, the only benefit we can get at the moment from exactly the same footprint is into Australia. We still have to pay tariffs into Japan, the EU, US, and Canada. So this firm, while they're happy that they just saved 5% into Australia, they're not so happy because they wanted to save more money elsewhere. So they might come to us and say, well, what if we source peaches from somewhere else? We don't have to use Chinese peaches. Let's use someone else's peaches. And in this case, we said, let's try peaches from Vietnam. So we're shifting up the sourcing. We're still manufacturing in Thailand. Let's think about that. Now we have some new benefits that come up. In particular, we have 2 agreements that we can use. We can use ASEAN-Japan, and we can still use ANSFTA, which keeps our tariffs at 0 for Australia, but significantly drops our tariffs into Japan, which were 16.8% down here at the bottom. This was the rate, and the rate is now 5.3% using ASEAN-Japan JEPA. So this gives us some additional benefits. If the Japanese tend to eat a lot of peaches from us, that's fantastic, because we could now have a lot of peach jam sold in Japan potentially that was not competitive before. So many firms will say that's great. We'll just switch up our sourcing of peaches and we should be in better shape. We'll now be in Vietnam and we'll stay with the manufacturing in Thailand. But some firms will say, well, what happens if instead of changing where we get our peaches from, what if we change where we manufacture? And what if we think about doing it here in Singapore? Now, this is an unusual choice, I think, for many. They will say, wow, why? This is a very expensive place to do business. We're not known for agricultural production here in Singapore, but just for the point of argument, let's look at the actual benefits that might be had from making peach jam here in Singapore. And it turns out there are some tremendous savings available because Singapore has a lot of trade agreements and a lot of very good agreements. The good agreements are deep, they're comprehensive, and they drop tariffs to zero. So what does that look like? Now, we're still going to source our peaches under scenario 3 from China because we have been and we're happy with our peaches from China. But now we have, as you can see in the next box, 4 different FTAs that we could potentially use for our different markets. So we can use the same ANSFTA for Australia. We can use Japan-Singapore FTA, which is much better in some respects than ASEAN-Japan. We can use the European Union Singapore FTA to get into the EU, and we can use US Singapore to get into the American market. We still don't have Canada covered under these particular agreements because we're using peaches from China and they may or may not qualify. So what have we done? If you look down here at the bottom, we still have the 0 tariffs into Australia, 5.3% into Japan, but look at, we've lost 24% of tariffs by 2026. We have a little bit of wait, but nonetheless, we will have 0 tariffs into the European Union from here. We have 0 tariffs into the US. So all of a sudden, if we move our production location from Thailand into Singapore and we just use FTAs, we have the potential to save quite a bit of money. Now, I know some of you will say, but you have to add in all the other factors and other costs, like having a facility in Singapore. Yes, you do. So it's not as automatic as saying, oh, the FTA is the greatest thing ever, but it's certainly, when you're talking about a reduction in tariffs from 24% to 0, is maybe worth considering. And so then we did a final exercise here. We said, well, let's imagine that you've never done peach jam, but you were thinking of starting a factory, or you really were flexible. So you said, let's start with, where do I get the best FTA benefits for making this peach jam? And that's the scenario 4 at the end here, where we move the sourcing of peaches to Vietnam. We still manufacture them here in Singapore. And now we have an advantage of an additional trade agreement, CPTPP, that we can use for some of these final markets. So you can now see that by 2026, we will have 0 tariffs for all of the major markets for peach jam. So if you move your sourcing to Vietnam from China, and if you moved your manufacturing from Thailand to Singapore, you have the potential to be duty-free into all of your major final markets. Now, again, there's some complications attached to this, but the point is that using FTAs can be an extremely successful way for firms to save an awful lot of costs and to think about as a sort of mechanism for thinking about changing up their supply chains. Because another challenge we've been finding when we do these discussions with firms about shifting their supply chains and disruption is that firms are a bit paralyzed at the outset because, I mean, the world is your oyster, so to speak. I don't know, what are there, 164 countries in the WTO right now. So there's 164 potential locations for you to source and manufacture and supply to, and that feels very daunting. And even if your own remit is just Asia or Asia x China, or fill in the blank what your particular space is, your particular geographic scope is, it still can feel overwhelming to figure out, how do I respond to a request from my C-suite to restructure our supply chains based on I don't quite know what. And so we're suggesting that for many firms, using FTAs especially as an entry point into thinking about how do we become more competitive at a time of great disruption makes a lot of sense. And again, you don't have to jump all the way to scenario 4 where everything changes. You can start with scenario 1, which is, let me just map my existing supply chain onto FTAs and make sure that we are using all of the potential benefits that we have available to us. So this is the scenarios as we've run through them with Peaches. And again, as you when you get the booklet afterwards, you can read about this again, or you can always contact us to work through these examples or work through similar kinds of examples for your own production and manufacturing, so that we can then tailor it for you and for what it is that you need. Do note the column here in the row here in the middle, rules of origin requirements. You know, these matter as well. I don't want to go into tremendous amount of detail, but let me just say, it's not your smiling face that gets you better benefits, sadly. And it's not even the fact that you are trading between two covered countries that will get you these FTA benefits. They're not automatic. You have to qualify for them, and you have to potentially apply for them, and particularly apply for certificates of origin, which SICC does issue, or be self-certified depending on the FTA. But the point is, it's not an automatic thing. So firms may say, and we've had this conversation a lot of companies come to us and they say, well, this is so great, I could save so much money. If it's that fabulous, we're doing it already. We must be taking advantage of these FTAs already because the benefits are significant. And so therefore, of course we're doing it. And then we start investigating and we discover that actually you're not doing so. You could, but you're not. And you're not because of a whole variety of reasons. Maybe you don't know, maybe you don't quite qualify, maybe you haven't thought through how this works, maybe your data is in 10,000 different spreadsheets located in different business units and nobody knows what's going on. And so the end result is that firms that could benefit from FTAs often do not because they haven't really thought this through. And until now, really, it didn't always make a lot of sense because the earlier FTAs were less helpful, they were less useful. The later FTAs, especially when you're dropping tariffs to zero, are significantly better, easier to use, and give you more benefits. So this is the scenarios that I want to talk to. And I just want to make one real caveat here, though, particularly because I saw that Frank is on this line and his company makes a lot of money helping you deal with a crisis after the fact. So I will note that one reason that firms don't always use FTAs is because if you are out of compliance, if your internal processes to make sure that you actually qualify for the preferences you are claiming is a problem, you can be on the hook for significant fines and penalties. And then you call Frank at PwC and they sort this out for you for quite a lot of money. So many firms say, oh, this is alarming to me. I don't want to get myself out of compliance. So we also are strongly recommending that if you're going to use FTAs, that you do so carefully, because you want to make sure that you maintain the right paperwork to show that in fact your peach jam, which is coming from any of these markets, qualifies using the FTA, that you meet the rules, that you meet the criteria, that you keep the documentation internally as you're required to do for 3 years or more. And then you can always stand up to an audit after the fact. If you've done your job right, then you get zero tariffs, and you do so with confidence that you are in compliance with the rules. So this is the different ways in which we imagine firms thinking about FTAs. And so normally what we do with companies when they come see us to talk about FTA and supply chains, we start with scenario one, because most firms say, well, let's just start with getting a clear assessment and a clear inventory of what we're currently doing. And then we can talk about how we might restructure or we might invest differently going forward. So usually we start with the first scenario. And just to give you this heads up, and then I think I'm finished with the slideshow, we can move to questions so I make sure I answer what you're concerned with. We have a whole checklist that we go through with firms to say, how do we know whether or not we're taking advantage of FTAs, what FTAs are available to us, and so forth. And so we typically say, first, what are you doing? Where are you doing it? And where are you trying to ship it? Because again, if you're trying to send products from Malaysia to the European Union, as an example, that's a problem, because right now we do not have an FTA that covers those two markets. Bit of an issue. For some countries where we don't have an agreement as such, they may qualify, especially our developing countries in the region. Many of them qualify for either US GSP, Generalized System of Preferences, which gives special access to developing countries at zero tariffs so that they can grow and develop. The European Union has an equivalent preference program for developing countries. Many firms use those, or they should be using those. Many firms don't know that those exist, but if they did, they would use them. So what are you doing? Where are you doing it? And you want to make sure that your markets are in fact covered by an agreement. If there's no agreement, then obviously this is a very short assessment, because if you can't move anything and there's no agreement covering your markets, then there's no FTA that you can use. You cannot hopscotch between FTAs. So what you cannot do is sort of say, oh, well, I'm going to use the first agreement to go from here to here, and then another agreement to go from here to here. And then end result is that I'm between two markets that are otherwise not covered. Pretty much the answer is no, can't do that. So you can't sort of hook them all together and then just send things across the chain. That doesn't work. So we check, what are you doing, where are you doing it, and where are you shipping things to? Then we say, well, what is the actual tariff that you're paying now? Which turns out to be harder for some companies to answer than I would have expected, because many firms don't seem to have a handle on what their tariff costs are. If the tariff costs or duty rates are significant, then we start to sort of narrow it down and we say, well, what do we think is likely to give you the best benefits given the current structure? And then we say, again, thinking about alternative ways of structuring so that you make sure that you qualify for FTA benefits. And then we say, here's the potential FTAs that work for you, and here's why. And then make sure, again, that this trade compliance strategy internally is in place so that you're not caught out by problems in the future. So the booklet that we're preparing has a bit more detail on the checklist itself. So if you want to do this yourself, you can do so, especially those of you who have in place software programs that help you. That's very helpful. But even without a software program, there are locations that you can look up just to see what would be the tariff rates for different kinds of things. So I think that is the end of my slideshow. So let me stop sharing so that you can actually, there we go. So that you can actually see me a bit larger and I can have the Q&A session now with Victor. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Debbie. That was illuminating on the prospects for peach jam. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions, and I
Sure.
would encourage the audience to type in their questions into the Q&A box. But I mean, how many companies practically will take the trouble to do what you suggest?
Smaller than I would like.
I beg your pardon?
Smaller than I would like. I would like most firms, even if they are not large firms themselves, I would like to see that more firms use these agreements because, among other things, there's a huge amount of effort expended by governments in negotiating these benefits. And it is a shame to me that we have so many of them available and firms don't use them. I mean, really, what are we doing? So for me, it would be nice if we use them, just surely on the amount of effort and taxpayer dollars that have gone into negotiating them, but also because firms can get really quite substantial benefits from using them. So I think it's sort of missed opportunity on both sides.
Yeah, I agree with you as a fellow believer in free trade and also the agreements that facilitate it. But I'm just wondering, you know, if you're, as I listened to and watched that slide on the various options for the production, the sourcing of peaches and all the rest of it, I'm just wondering how many companies would you know, necessarily have that knowledge to start that process.
Mm.
And
well, one of the things that we found so fascinating about this is the number of companies that have no ability to do this themselves, which is why we are starting to develop this material so that we can give it to firms, because, you know, it's a specialized set of skills. And what we're discovering as we've been, you know, involved in this for quite some time now is that everyone thinks that someone else is already doing this. So everyone in the company just assumes that that person over there in that function, they must be doing it. So trade compliance must be doing it, legal must be doing it, our freight forwarder must be doing it, our 3PL must be doing it. The firm is telling the 3PL, the software is telling us, like somebody always assumes that somewhere in my firm, this is happening. And what we discovered, or what we've been discovering, is that a surprising number of firms, including some incredibly competitive global companies, haven't got a clue how to even begin. They've never used FTAs. They're not structurally set up to use FTAs. They don't know where they would turn to ask for advice on this. And so this is why we have started doing a lot more of this corporate advisory work, because we discovered that no one quite offers the solutions that you would like if you were a firm. So let me just give you one simple example. You know, we started working with software providers to say there's a lot of software that should make this a lot easier, because once you get complicated, a peach jam is fairly straightforward, but you know, once you get more complicated products, all of a sudden, like, holy cow, you know, we export 85 different versions of peach jam, and they go in different markets and back packaging and, you know, about sugar content and complicated things. So we're going to use the software, but the software, the way that it comes is sort of like, the analogy I give is it's a little like buying Microsoft Excel. Fabulous program, does amazing things. But when you're handed Microsoft Excel, or now you download it and you put it on your computer, you open it up and you go, okay, there's a whole bunch of boxes and I don't really know what I'm supposed to do with this. So then you have to have some kind of training or capacity building or something for you to be able to use this program to its fullest extent. And we find the same thing with sort of trade compliance software and FTA kinds of software. And then at other point along the way, it's the same sort of thing, which is, yes, there's fabulous benefits, but you know, you often need someone who points you in the right direction, because left to your own devices, you don't even know where to start.
Yeah, and I think that is a big challenge, and it goes back to that point that you mentioned about the time and effort that governments, particularly here in Singapore, go into negotiating these FTAs, and then the deep frustration when they're not being utilized as much as they could be. And as you pointed out, Singapore, unlike many other countries, has a real plethora of free trade agreements that companies could leverage potentially to help them save costs. In your discussions with companies, is there a sort of, I mean, obviously every business is different, every product is different, but is there a sort of a best practice in terms of who should be driving this within a business? You know, is it the shipping department? Is it finance? In your experience with your clients, who are the key drivers in a business to begin to understand the advantages that FTAs can offer?
Well, I think one of the reasons why we have such difficulties using FTAs is that the management function has been distributed. So we have, you know, procurement or supply chain folks who may or may not be talking to the legal and trade compliance people, who may or may not have been talking to the freight forwarders, who may or may not have been talking to fill in the blank who. And so you end up with a sort of, again, this sort of round robin of, I don't think I'm responsible, but you must be. And no, it's not me, it must be you. And it gets complicated. I would say, where should it be will probably also vary, unfortunately, based on the company. So for some companies, and again, it depends on your size and your complexity. For some companies, it will be the supply chain and procurement people. In some places, it's actually the sales team that identifies the biggest problem, because they say, well, I'm out here trying to sell whatever this is, and our costs are 18% higher than our competitors' costs. And if we could do something about that, I could sell more. But when those salespeople come back, they don't really, you know, again, what sort of who in the company do I need to tell this to? And is there a trade agreement that would match that problem for me? And would they recognize it? You know, so I think the challenge is it's located all over. And for most of the companies that we have, it's not until the C-suite gets involved, and the C-suite then says to everybody, this is a priority for us. Figure out if there's benefits to be had, what they are, and then we'll sort out who's responsible for it after the fact. But let's start with figuring out if there is potential revenue that we're leaving on the table or market opportunities that we haven't accessed. And so the C-suite seems to be the best way to do this, at least it seems to us, is start with C-suite down. But again, it depends on the companies. We've had companies that have come to us that appear, from my perspective, again, this is a very, very subjective view, because I'm thinking about it from, you know, are you ready to use something like this? Do you have trade compliance in place? Totally disorganized. They may be fabulous at what they do. They may be amazing at selling whatever it is, but, you know, internally, holy cow, you know, we're in like 15 different places. We have people who don't talk to each other. You know, so internally a bit of a mess. And that also complicates things. So I think key C-suite arrows somebody, your job is to make this happen, and then they coordinate among all of the relevant constituent groups who might have a say or a role in this. As long as at the end of the day, someone actually makes a decision, because that's another challenge we're running into. We get firms who, we go through all of this exercise, inventory, assessment, and at the end of it, they go, yeah, this sounds complicated, so we're gonna pass for now. You know, we're gonna just keep doing what we're doing, because none of us really wants the responsibility of making it happen.
It's just too hard.
To be fair, it can appear daunting, right? It can. It doesn't have to be, and you don't have to take your entire operation from zero to completely, beautifully, 100% ready. You could do this in pieces. You could do this by, you know, key items. We find with a lot of firms that they're actually using FTAs, but their challenge is because they don't do this all day, right? So if you don't do trade all day long, then you're not mentally prepared to do this exercise of thinking about harnessing trade agreements to do what you're doing. So you say, well, my current operations were fine. Okay, that's fantastic. Kudos to you, I'm delighted. But you're also not thinking about what are new agreements that make a difference, or what are opportunities that we're missing. And you don't do that because you're not, again, that's not your job. That's not your day job, is to sit and think about trade agreements and how they affect my company. But if it was your day job to do so, then you would say, wow, actually, as an example, this RCEP, which is coming, is something super important. We should be paying attention to that because the benefits are significant. And so, you know, if it's not your day job, it's hard to keep an eye on this. So we also suggest for firms that they do a sort of, it doesn't have to be every day for heaven's sakes, but, you know, like an annual check-in, and just say, does our current structure still match existing trade agreement benefits? Or should we think about adding or making sure that we tighten up compliance so we're ready for this next thing?
Right, and so leadership, again, as always, counts, and hence your comment, starting from the C-suite and getting the focus first in a business. Would you agree that, I mean, we're just really at the beginning of what will be prolonged disruption, not just because of the pandemic, but because of geopolitics?
Yes, especially in some sectors. So some sectors will be less affected, and some sectors are going to be badly affected for a long period of time. And we are unclear about how that will fall out. And again, the disruption can be from pandemic. So if you're travel and tourism, of course, disruption, who knows how long. It can be from geopolitical tensions. And again, the level of disruption is unclear. And sometimes what we are finding in particular as well is that firms have a hard time seeing where those potential threats might come from. So my original example is a case in point. This is a firm that had no business in technology transfer disputes between the US and China, totally irrelevant to them. And then suddenly 25% more tariffs, and then suddenly 25% more tariffs over a fight over aircraft. I mean, they had no idea this was coming, and they had no idea it was going to hit their firm. And to be fair to them, why would they know? Like, why would they pay attention to this? They have day jobs that require them to focus on solving the problem of today, and occasionally sort of, you know, peeking up above the parapet to say what is coming next. But even for those people to imagine that somehow a 14-year-old WTO dispute on Boeing and Airbus would have implications for my firm, that would be a miracle, I think, for a firm to have thought that through, especially a firm in the sector that's not at all relevant, to have thought that through and said, wow, let's prepare for that. So I think that's the tricky part for firms. We're going to get more of the sort of Boeing and Airbus kinds of, you know, disruption than you have been used to dealing with, because as the global trading system starts to collapse, which it has already started to collapse, and will probably continue at this level of total dysfunction for some period of time, there are more and more things that you need to be, you know, again, looking over the parapet and saying, where is the next thing coming at me where I didn't expect it to come?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does increase the challenge for any business. But it's something that we all have to just get used to and adapt to, and try and manage to the best of our ability. I mean, it really is tough. But given the advantages that the FTAs can bring, it's worth spending the time. to understand, well, are we manufacturing in the most optimal location? And are we sourcing in the most optimal location to benefit us and our products, our customers, and our shareholders?
I mean,
Debbie,
of course, I think so.
of course
But
you
I
do.
would say, I mean, after you've done a couple of these and you've seen what are the potential benefits on the table for firms, you say, wow, isn't it amazing that not everyone does this? Like, how can this be? How can this be? I mean, there are some firms, to be fair as well, there are some firms or sectors for which FTAs can be more beneficial than others. But I'm always a bit shocked by for example, the level of tariffs in things that you would not have imagined. So let me give you another example. Company that I was working with yesterday, they are producing a brand new product. So it's a brand new issue, brand new thing. And I said, and it's a weird item. Okay, so it's an innovative new thing. I'm not going to get into the details of what the thing is, but brand new item. And I said, your biggest issue at the beginning, classification. Because if they count this as in this bucket of categories of things, your tariffs are way higher than if they count it as this bucket of things. So this particular thing kind of is a therapy device that falls in between athletic equipment and therapy and medical, and it's kind of in the middle of all of these things. If you get the classification wrong, and they say, a government comes back and says, this thing is medical, especially, that's tricky because you could have much higher tariffs. You're going to have compliance issues around it. You might have to get approval from they want to export to the US, so Food and Drug Administration, FDA approvals for medical devices of any kind may need special certification and qualification. That could be very complicated. But if you could count it, one other way to classify it could be some sort of, athletic thing for sports people. Okay, well, if we counted it as that, your tariffs could be, you may not have all of the compliance things, but your tariffs are going to be 5.5%, which, for a low margin product, that's a lot. If you, however, you classified this, get it classified as a massage apparatus, I don't even want to imagine in my head what the rest of those things are, but whatever those are, 0 tariffs into the US. So part of this as well is not just using the FTA, it's making sure that you are classified properly in the first place, not just when you create the product, but that you remain classified, because the classification criteria change every 5 years. The global World Customs Organization shifts classification, and for some products, they keep getting thrown into the wrong categories. And when that happens to you, you're paying tariffs that you might not need to pay, or paying higher tariffs just because you're classified incorrectly. And so this is becoming an increasing issue for firms as well. It's not just using the FTA, it's making sure that, if we're going to send in, I don't know what, like a ballpoint pen, that the pen is in the right category. And this is especially true for, say, ASEAN, because ASEAN loves to throw everything into other, and then you pay more tariffs because it's classified as other instead of ballpoint pen.
One final question before we go. What do you think is needed to make all of this so much simpler for everybody, for governments, for companies?
It would be so much easier if we could have global agreements. Generally larger agreements are better, and global is best, because then you're not trying to deal with 500 different possible applications for peach jam. You would have one agreement, and you would say, that's the tariff for peach jam, and I know what the rules are, and they're not going to change, and they're held consistently, and that would be much better for firms. So I think global is better. Large regional is next best. And then after that is bilateral, but it's very hard in general. It's very hard for firms to use bilateral agreements, because think about the peach jam example. It is rare that you can make an entire jar of jam based on the ingredients and components in just 2 countries, or largely from 2 countries. So it can be hard to qualify under bilateral. So that's why the larger ones are better. And obviously global is best, because then it lets firms, not just multinationals, but even tiny firms, be able to compete in a global market much easier. They don't have to worry about falling afoul of particular rules, and their consistency remains.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your time. It's been great to see you again. We're going to have to bring you back and have another session on RCEP when this great agreement is finally signed.
well, let's be cautious on great. Helpful, beginning steps, yes, absolutely. Great, but it will be helpful for firms, especially firms in Asia who are trying to make peach jam and send it around Asia. It should be better, but it will be complicated early on.
Fair enough. We look forward to hearing from you how businesses can navigate through that complexity. So thank you, Debbie. Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
Not
Appreciate
at
it.
all. Thank the audience for your attention. And if there's anything that we can help you with, drop us a note to here to help at sicc.com.sg. You can include your wishes as well as your needs. And from me and the team, see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.